Hi and welcome everybody. It's lovely to have you here with us. We've got people joining us from all different parts of the world today, so whatever time of day it is for you, you're so welcome. Where I am in the southwest of England, there is intermittent, very bright sunlight, so if you see me squinting at any point, that's nothing for you to worry about. In this webinar, we're going to be exploring the habit of being present, how engaging our whole unique selves can help us to deepen our encounters. My name is Luke and I'm part of the Difference team, which is a part of Archbishop Justin Welby's Ministry of Reconciliation. And I'm going to be co-presenting today's webinar alongside Victoria. Victoria, would you like to say hello to everybody?
Hello, I'm Victoria, as Luke has said, and I'm part of Archbishop Justin's reconciliation team, working alongside Luke and others on the Difference course and other things.
Brilliant. And we're really excited on this webinar to be joined by a guest speaker, Mariam Tadros, who is the technical specialist for peace building at Tearfund. Mariam, would you like to just introduce yourself and just say a little bit about yourself?
Hi Luke, thanks. Really good to be with you today. I'll also apologise if the sun suddenly shines by me. It's not my saintlyhood. Yeah, as Luke said, I lead the peace building team at Tearfund and co-lead our Fragile States work. And it's been a real joy to join you today, and have really enjoyed working with the reconciliation team over the last few years intermittently as well.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Mariam. Just a few points of housekeeping before we get going properly. If you're watching live, don't worry that you can't see yourself on camera. That's just how this webinar is going to work, but there's plenty of opportunity for you to interact in other ways. You're also muted, so don't worry about making any noise. If you need to eat any snacks whilst you're doing it, don't feel self-conscious about that. That's absolutely fine. This webinar is being recorded, so just be aware of that when you're interacting with different things, and you can rewatch it on YouTube afterwards, a day after, and you can find the link to that YouTube playlist on our website. Please feel free to submit questions at any point using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window. We'll be having some time for Q&A towards the end of the webinar, but as and when those pop into your head, please put those in. And if they're for one of us specifically, just specify that in your question. Please use the chat for any issues with technical support you're having. Kira from our team is on hand to help you with any of those things. If you have any more general comments or feedback you'd like to give on that, that's also absolutely fine using the chat for that. You might want to post it to all attendees so everyone can see what's happening there as well. And you're going to get sent a link after this webinar to a feedback form. It takes about 5 minutes to do, and it is so valuable to us to improve and also to see how you're finding things. So I'd really encourage you to do that if you can. In case any of you need to nip off a little bit early on this webinar, here's just a little bit of information about our webinar next week. It's happening at 8 p.m. UK time, and it's looking at our final habit, Reimagine, exploring how rooting ourselves deeply in God can enable us to find hope in the places we long to see change. And we've got a guest speaker for that webinar too, Reverend Rene August, who's a theologian and priest, reconciliation trainer, and a veteran of the anti-apartheid movement. So, just before we get started, shall I pray for us? Loving God, we welcome you into this space. We bring before you the days we have had ahead of this webinar. And we pray that in this hour or so we have together, you would speak to us. All of this is for you. Would you teach us what it looks like to step into the things you've called us to do? Would we know you better? Would we love you more deeply? In Jesus' name, amen. So, as I mentioned, Victoria and I are part of Archbishop Justin Welby's reconciliation team. Archbishop Justin has a vision for the church to be a reconciling presence in the midst of conflict, answering that call really that we see in the gospel of God reconciling himself to us, and then calling us to step into his ministry of reconciliation. Sometimes the word reconciliation has a lot of associations and it can feel like quite a technical term. And that's really why we've created the Difference movement, to help us understand what it means and how we can step into it in our everyday lives, how it can become a part of our discipleship. These webinars in particular are exploring the habits that are at the center of difference, the teaching in the middle of it. And we're going to be exploring them and how we can apply them to our lives right now. We also have something called the Difference course, which is a 5-session course for church groups to take this stuff a bit deeper in their communities, to think about what this looks like in their context and how it can be applied across different kinds of encounters. We run training events that are a bit different to this for those who want to run the course, and we're doing some more of those in the autumn. So I'd encourage you, if you're interested in that, have a look at the website. The link is, the address is just at the bottom of the slide, and you can find all the details about that and get registered. So on to this webinar. We talk loads about these 3 habits here on the Difference team. They're rooted in scripture and they're seen in the life of Jesus, and they are enable us to live out this call to reconcile. They're be curious, be present, and reimagine. And in this webinar, we're going to go deeper with the second of these, be present. We're going to share a bit of why it's important, as well as how we can instill it and nurture it as a value, as a habit. We're then going to interview Mariam, who's going to share some of her experience and knowledge and wisdom with us. And then there'll be a time for any questions you have for us. And a reminder, you can put these in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen at any time. But first of all, to warm us up a little bit, I often find it quite interesting to see what famous people say about the things that you're interested in. So we've done just that in the lead up to this webinar. We've had a look at what the wider culture has to say about this idea of being present. And we've got this quote: "The 2 most powerful warriors are patience and time." And we're going to put up a little poll for you in just a second to ask you that question. Who said that? Was it the Dalai Lama, Pope Francis, Leo Tolstoy, Desmond Tutu, or the Queen? Hopefully you can see that poll on your screen. I'd love you to vote and see who you think said it. I'm going to give you just 10 seconds to do this. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and I'm ending the polling. Sorry, brutal there. So there we go. Gosh, overwhelmingly people have said Desmond Tutu there. 53% of you thought it was Desmond Tutu who had that quote. Dalai Lama coming in second there, and then followed by Leo Tolstoy, and Pope Francis and the Queen tying there. Well, I can reveal to you that in fact it was Leo Tolstoy who said that in War and Peace. So well done to the well-read amongst you. You might have got that. That's what Leo Tolstoy thought about being present, but we're going to have a bit of think about what we mean by it. Victoria.
Great, thanks so much, Luke. Now, if you joined us last week when we were talking about being curious, you may remember that our special guest, Stephanie, talked about a passage in the Bible where Jesus meets a Samaritan woman at a well. And to explore what we mean by being present, we're just going to start right there with that passage, that incredible encounter that Jesus chooses to have. So it's taken from John's Gospel, and it begins this way. So Jesus had to go through Samaria. He came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" His disciples had gone into the town to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" For Jews do not associate with Samaritans. Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." "Sir," the woman said, "you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did also his sons and his livestock?" And so, in the heat of the day, by this well, a man and a woman who, just by being a man and a woman, were having a very unusual conversation, and even more so because it was a Jew and a Samaritan. There they are, and so begins the longest conversation of Jesus that's recorded in the Gospels. And it goes on to be quite a sparky conversation. We see the beginnings of that there. There's misunderstanding, possibly sometimes deliberate misunderstanding, a real sense that this is a bit spiky. It's not an easy conversation. And why have we started there with this exploration of be present? Well, it's because Jesus does three things that seem to be fundamental to what it means to be present. First of all, he shows up. So a key part of being present is just being there in and of ourselves. If you like, it's being present in our body. We're there. Jesus chooses to be there in this unusual place, engaging with this unexpected person. And we all know that thriving relationships depend on showing up, on spending time together. And when we're seeking to build relationships in a context that's difficult or different, that might mean showing up in the unlikely places. It might mean spending time with the unknown, or even the people we consider our enemies. And definitely Jews and Samaritans considered one another enemies at that time. And it's choosing to encounter the other person as they are, not as we would want them to be. So it's about showing up, being there in body. Secondly, it's about sticking around. What we see in this long conversation of Jesus with this woman is that he keeps going. When she starts raising questions about, "Oh, do you think you're better than our ancestor Jacob?" I think I'd have been off, but Jesus sticks with it and engages her, listens to what she's saying, meets her where she is. And so much of being present is not just being present in body, but being present in mind, choosing to stick with it, to have our concentration on that other person, on this encounter. Choosing to sit in the difference and in the difficulty when our instinct is to back off, to turn around, go the other way, leave it. So we show up in our bodies and we show up in our mind in choosing to focus our mind on the other person, focus our concentration, our attention on the other person, and showing them in the process that we value them, that this encounter matters to us. And in a culture of distraction, that is very countercultural, and that is not the way we're increasingly programmed to be. So showing up, sticking around, and finally bringing our whole selves. And in a way, being present is exactly that. It is bringing our body, our mind, but also our soul, our heart, our unique complexity. Because we can bring our attention and we can bring our body, but if we're not actually bringing who we are, then that's not really going to build a meaningful, authentic relationship with the other person. So we come as we are and encounter the other person or God or creation as they are. And we see that with Jesus in this passage of the woman at the well. He begins by asking her for a drink. And you can see how this disarms the Samaritan woman. Jesus shows that vulnerability. He shows his need. He asks for help. He brings his thirsty self to that encounter. And when we do the same, when we bring our honesty, when we bring our questions, that can completely transform the dynamic of a difficult conversation. It builds on that idea of curiosity and not having all the answers. When we bring that our unique selves to that encounter. And just as being undistracted is countercultural, it's also countercultural to recognize our uniqueness. It's all too easy to fall into tribes, into an ideological bunker where, well, my tribe thinks this, so I have to bring that tribe with me everywhere I go. But we're all more complex than that. We may think one thing that agrees with one group and another thing that agrees with another group. And by being vulnerable enough to share who we are, we can build meaningful relationship with the other person. It's not about sharing our whole life story, but just taking the example of Jesus and having the courage to be vulnerable. So that's what we mean by being present, showing up in our body, sticking around, not just physically, but mentally and with our concentration, and bringing our whole selves in our uniqueness and complexity and vulnerability to that encounter. So I'm going to hand back to Luke to unpack a bit more of what that looks like.
Thanks, Victoria. So we're going to explore why it's important to practice this, to be present across 4 interconnected relationships: our relationship with God, with others, with creation, and with ourselves. And these are really the relationships in which we can learn this new way of being to help us put our faith into practice, where we might see encounters happen, and also where we might see brokenness, and how we can step into some of that. So how can we be present across each of these? We're going to look first at what it means to be present with others. And much of Jesus' ministry is just as much about his presence as the words he actually says. Often he is present with those that others would rather avoid, and those he's kind of in conflict with as well, people who definitely wouldn't call themselves his friends. Jesus spends time that's really unhurried with other people, and he often has many meals as well. He's often both host and guest. We see him going around Simon the Pharisee's house and Zacchaeus' house for dinner, but we also see him cooking fish on the beach for Peter after the resurrection. In today's day and age, as Victoria alluded to, we live in an age of distraction, and being present with others can feel quite countercultural. Our lives are stretched and hurried and busy. How often do arguments begin with those we're nearest and dearest to when we're under time pressure to leave the house, or when we know there's a deadline? I know that growing up for me, one of the most fractious points in the week was just before we were about to leave to go to church, and there's something that's got to be slightly wrong about that. But by being present, we can strengthen our relationships. Father Jacques Philippe writes about an attitude of availability towards the other. He says, in every encounter with someone else, however long or short, we should make him feel we're 100% there for him at that moment, with nothing else to do except be with him. Good manners, yes, but also real, heartfelt availability. This foundation, this posture of availability makes it a lot more possible to express our convictions and our difference with authenticity and confidence. Being fully present isn't just about our attention, but it's also about bringing the full complexity of who we are and being vulnerable with other people. And we see this modeled in God's vulnerability with us in becoming God incarnate, Jesus Christ, in his vulnerability, his exposure to everything that an earthly human life implies. Vulnerability creates connection in a way that little else can. Brené Brown talks about it this way: vulnerability isn't winning or losing. It's having the courage to show up and be seen when we have no control over the outcome. Vulnerability is not weakness, it is our greatest measure of courage. So there's a little bit about being present to others. We're now going to have a bit of a look at being present with ourselves. In our first webinar in this series, we explored how we're called by Christ to love our neighbour as ourselves. And therefore, practicing reconciliation with ourselves is an essential part of how we are towards other people as well. Listening to our needs and feelings and choosing not to run away enables us to attend to those needs rather than distracting ourselves from them, or causing hurt by recognizing not recognizing where our needs aren't being met. I have a friend who was sharing with me how the other day they suddenly felt this real tightness and anxiety in their chest that felt like it had come really out of the blue. But when she spent some time reflecting on it, she realized that had come off the back of a lot of anxious feelings and thoughts that she hadn't really been present with at the time, and it ended up kind of culminating in this moment. There's also a danger that we might try and meet the needs we feel in unhealthy ways, in unhealthy relationships with others, and often that can lead to disappointment or disillusionment when people don't live up to our hopes and expectations. Distracting ourselves can also feel more comfortable than coming to terms with the feelings that we might not want to deal with. But sitting with the reality and complexity and mess is essential to enable us to be present with others, to adopt that humble stance that Brené Brown was talking about. And of course, being present with ourselves can't be separated from our relationship with God. This isn't just about wellness, although that has a place, but this is about who we are becoming. This is about stepping into our call, stepping into our place and learning to know God better. But we need to connect with our reality in order to bring that to God. Becoming present has long been a Christian practice that prepares us for prayer. I'm just going to share a quick quote for this. We don't need to be fearful when we come to God. Seeing our mess and fracture through the lens of God's mercy is essential. And in Interior Freedom, Jacques Philippe, who I quoted earlier, recalls these words said to him by a friend. Don't be afraid of yourselves. Don't be afraid of all that you are in your human reality, where God pitches his tent to dwell with you. God is incarnation. God's new name is Emmanuel. God is with us. God with your reality. Open yourself to it without fear. Only in the measure you discover yourself will you discover the depths of his love. So that leads us on nicely to have a think about what it means to be present with God. Rowan Williams, who's the former Archbishop of Canterbury, put being present with God a bit like this. It's sometimes been said that the real problem in prayer is not the absence of God, but the absence of us. We're all over the place, entertaining memories, fantasies, anxieties. God is simply there in unending patience, saying to us, so when are you actually going to arrive? When are you going to sit and listen, to stop roaming about and be present? Somehow, in our stillness, we are seeking to connect with that moment of creation, the eternal reality of God speaking, God giving, God calling us into life. I feel like the quotes are doing a lot of the heavy lifting for me on this webinar. That unhurried time builds relationship. Jesus himself is frequently withdrawing to pray with the Father, and Jesus is one with the Father, so how much more is it important for us to do that? A strong image we see in the Bible of sitting in God's presence is in Luke chapter 10, where Jesus visits the home of Mary and Martha, and Mary is sat attentively at Jesus' feet, whilst Martha hurries around making preparations. I've got to confess that I empathise quite a lot with Martha in this story, and in many situations I really identify with her behaviour. Those acts of service are good things, but I've often used those as a way to keep myself busy and actually hold that closeness, that presence with God at an arm's length. And the things that I find difficult or uncomfortable about myself, I can keep them to myself so long as I keep myself busy enough. But by doing so, I risk missing out on that richness of the unhurried time at Jesus' feet. There's no agenda. The reward for Mary is just Jesus. And it's only by slowing down and allowing the whirring around of my thoughts and feelings to settle that I can begin to hear God's voice well. When we bring our struggles and our vulnerabilities to God, we're choosing to trust that his love and his mercy can hold them, trusting that he is enough. So we're now going to go on to look at being present with creation. Quite a natural progression from being curious about creation is to actually be present with it. If we're asking God what we can discover of God through creation, through this curiosity, then we need to stick with that encounter in order to hear the answer. We can't really rush it. We're not sat in the dentist waiting room flicking through a National Geographic. Scientific research has discovered that human well-being increases when we spend 2 hours a week outside in the natural world. And I recognise that's not possible for everybody, and there's a point there about inequality, but it shows our need, our human need for sustained connection with the natural world. During lockdown, I've been back at home living with my parents, and my dad's enjoyed putting on a live stream of an osprey's nest. It's called Osprey Webcam if anyone is interested. And though that's not quite being outside, it's been a nice way to be present with creation. I am a millennial, I promise. The more we spend time with God's creation, the more we actually might notice about it, and the more we might notice is actually out of step with created order. We start to engage with some of the mess and the brokenness we might see. And starting with this will lead us to a place where we can start to reimagine a better future. Reimagine being the third habit we're going to be looking at in our next webinar. So the habits are really strongly interlinked in all of this stuff. The theologian René August, who's also speaking next week, writes this: the prophets are those who've had a long, hard look at the world. They've examined their context well and listened to the pain of those on the margins. They have seen the contradictions, injustices, idolatry, hypocrisy, and hopelessness that surround them. And in the Bible, we see the prophet Isaiah taking this long, hard look, refusing to look away, sticking with it, looking at creation. He writes, "The earth dries up and withers, the world languishes and withers. The heavens languish with the earth is defiled by its people. They have disobeyed the laws, violated the statutes, and broken the everlasting covenant." It's not the happiest of Bible passages on the surface, but there's actually hope to be found in that moment as Isaiah refuses to look away from the brokenness he sees in created order around him. The process of being present with creation and with the circumstances we face is tough and uncomfortable. Nobody says it's fun, but it also creates fertile ground for us to invite God's Spirit to be at work. So that's a little bit of a look at those four relationships and what it means to be present in all of them. Victoria is going to take us through how we can start to do that and apply that in our own lives. Victoria.
Great, thank you. So I wonder, as you've been listening to all of that, before we get on to how we can do this, how can we be present, it can be quite helpful to think, actually, what makes it tough? What stops us being present? What gets in the way? Just for 30 seconds, I would love you, if you were able to respond in the chat to all attendees and panelists about what for you are those blocks. What are the things that stop us being present or that get in the way? And I'll have a look at what comes in and the different things that make it difficult for us. Already got busyness has come in, which I think is a huge one. Fear, mind wandering, having 2 Zoom calls on at the same time. That sounds like my worst nightmare. Busy lives, a lot of busyness and fear and self-protection, self-occupied. Fear of what we might find in ourselves is a really interesting one. Very perceptive. And conflicting priorities, thinking about what's coming next. And actually that seems to be a bit of a recurring theme, is like looking ahead to the future, planning the next thing, not being here now, focus on self. Wow, well, thank you so much for responding in such vulnerability and also such perceptiveness and insight about what those things are that stop us from being present. I think you'll recognize a few of them in the ones that I'm about to talk about. The very first one out of the blocks was busyness. It'll have been quite clear that unhurried time and dedicating our full attention are so crucial, but actually really difficult to combine with packed diaries and continual competing pressures. When it comes to being present with God, exactly what that looks like for you will be different. For some of us, we need silence. Some of us need solitude. Some of us need stillness. Some of us need a combination of all 3. But none of those are really compatible with feeling pulled in 23 directions at once. So busyness is huge. The second, I think, is risk. Bringing your whole self, being vulnerable, opens us up to the possibility that our vulnerability won't be reciprocated. What if someone takes advantage when we struggle, when we share our struggles as well as our strength? Will this go wrong? Will this be okay? And kind of linked to that is discomfort. The fact is that it's quite uncomfortable. The places we most feel the need to be present are probably the places where we feel least like doing it. Whether that's because we think or we are going to hear what we don't want to hear, or we're going to start thinking about what we don't want to think about. I think for me, in terms of being present with God, I remember doing it one time and writing to myself, this is always worth doing. And yet I run away from it, because what if all these thoughts fill my head? I kind of don't want to make that space. So sticking with something uncomfortable doesn't feel good, even when it's with God. So let alone with someone who actually we have a disagreement with, or who makes us feel uncomfortable. And finally, apathy, I think, is a big one. That the value of being present is building relationship. And sometimes we might not even want to build that relationship. And we've got a lot going on in our lives. And do I have time to invest in this other person who may not reciprocate my gesture? And do I really care enough to have a thriving relationship with that person? And I hope I'm not the only person who ever thinks that. But I think some of these are the blocks. And it can, like I said, be helpful just to acknowledge those before we look at how we can do it. But having done that, how can we do it? When we acknowledge the things that make it difficult, that means it doesn't take us by surprise. And I think the very first thing to say is we can ask for God's help. At the end of this webinar, we're going to pray the encounter prayer that we prayed last week. And that is really just inviting God in before we have an encounter that might be difficult or challenging for us. But what are some of the other practical steps we can take? And I'm going to look at this in terms of those 3 elements of being present that we talked about before: showing up, sticking around, and bringing our whole selves. How can we show up? Well, the big one's going to be time, isn't it? When we asked what made it difficult, it was busyness, and busyness pulling us in lots of different directions. So thinking about how can I make pockets of time in a very busy diary, and taking practical steps. Is there someone I can ask who can help me? Can they be responsible for this thing that I'm usually responsible for during this chunk of time? And then can I have the discipline or the strength not to fill that time with lots of other things that really need doing? So can I make time? And can I ask someone else to help me make time? Can I notice opportunities? It's not just about having oodles and oodles of time. Showing up can be about noticing where I can give that attention. So it can be about noticing opportunities when I'm outside to really focus on what it is I'm seeing. It can be noticing opportunities to spend time with someone different, or to spend time in a different place. A little bit more difficult at the moment if you're in a lockdown situation. But what are those opportunities that I have to show up, just to be me in a different place, and to experience something that is outside my comfort zone? That's showing up. How can we stick around? So 2 very important things to say about this. Sticking around is not about staying in an abusive situation. If you're in an abusive relationship, you need to get out, and this is not about staying with that. Likewise, if you're having an argument with someone, it can be a really good idea to take a bit of time out, take 5, maybe take an hour, just to let things calm down a little bit, and then be able to show up and be able to bring your whole self in a much kind of better frame of mind. So sticking around isn't about persisting with a conversation that's absolutely going nowhere. What it is about is not giving up on the relationship, giving up on the other person, where that's a relationship that could thrive. So how can we do that? Once again, notice, pay attention. When am I tempted to be half present? Maybe my mind elsewhere. Maybe I've got several windows open while I'm having this video conversation. I don't, by the way, but I sometimes do. And what are my Achilles heels? What are the things that are my go-to distractions? And then putting some things in place that make it more difficult. So I have a do not disturb mode on my phone, which kicks into action at the same time every day, and I don't even have to think about it, and that helps me a lot. And then that sticking around is, again, sitting in the discomfort. So if I've been curious enough to seek out the story of someone else, or to seek out the story of someone experiencing the impact of climate change, whatever that might be, can I let it sink in? Can I really engage with the complexity and the mess of it, without just moving on immediately to the other thing, or to the need to kind of cheer myself up as soon as possible? Can I sit in that difficulty? And then finally, the idea of bringing your whole self. How can we do that? Can we notice the things we tend to hold back when we're with someone that we disagree with? Are there things that we feel reluctant to share of ourselves? Are there things that we find ourselves thinking, oh, I should say this when I'm talking to God, maybe, rather than bringing how we actually are? Being honest with ourselves, with God, with others. I talked a little bit about not being an ideological type, breaking out of our tribes. So, for example, one of the areas where we all kind of tribalized a little bit, or so it seemed, was around Brexit. And then it seemed to be that sometimes the people who thought one thing about Brexit also all thought the same thing about lockdown. And maybe you didn't, and maybe I didn't. And do we have the courage to bring our complexity and not feel the need to have the support of a whole ideological tribe behind us? And then showing our human side. Like I said, this doesn't have to be sharing the deepest things about you with every person you meet. And it's probably a good idea not to do that. But if it feels a bit difficult to share something that really matters a lot from the get-go, can we at least take Jesus' example and ask for help from someone we wouldn't normally? It might just be saying, oh, can you help me understand such and such? Because I don't really get this, and I would like to understand it better. So those are just a few ideas. I'm going to hand back to Luke now.
Thanks, Victoria. So we've just shared some of our thinking with you, why it's important to practice these across those different relationships and how we can start to do it. Let's just take 2 minutes to reflect on this question. What opportunities do you have to be present this week? Maybe bring it before God. We're going to take 2 minutes. I'm going to play some music and then we'll come back for our interview with Mariam. Okay, We're coming on to the point of the webinar now where we're going to interview our guest speaker, Mariam Tadros. Mariam, can I invite you to join us? It is absolutely brilliant to have you here with us. Thank you so much for taking the time. You are beautifully backlit by the weather outside of you. So it's wonderful to have you.
Thanks, Luke.
I wondered if I could start off by asking you where you have seen the value of being present and where you most see a need for it.
Thanks, Luke. Yeah, there's a couple of things I'd love to share. And on that particular question of where do I see the need for it most, I've really seen it where there is any situation where we need to come closer to each other and sometimes even come closer to ourselves. It really plays out in most relationships perhaps that we have, and particularly where there's experiences of conflict, experiences of grief. Presence is also required where there are experiences of joy as well. I think we will all have our own experiences of where we just, we've had a wedding or a funeral or a conflict with someone, and what we remember the most is who was there and how they were there in that space. But particularly where there needs to be reconciliation. And I've really experienced both in my own life and through the work that we do at Tear Fund and other experiences, that how much the quality of someone's presence can both change us and it can really make or break relationships. So that's just on the point of where I would say I see the need for it the most. And in terms of the value of being present, there's kind of three things I'd like to kind of share. One, which is the value, like I said, of the quality of who and how we are with others, and that the value of that being that it can really bring transformation. We'll all know that there are people in our lives who either bring us peace or agitate us. And there's just something of the character of who we've become over our life that can really change the space in which we might share with them. The second thing for me is that it really does change us. It brings transformation within ourselves and within relationships and within others. That ability to be either physically present or otherwise, but mostly physically present, and that full presence that both you and Victoria were talking about, I've really genuinely seen it change circumstances just by the way that we are and the quality of who we are in that space. And the third thing that I think is really important is that it allows us to bring, and I think Victoria, you just said it, it allows us to bring complexity into our often dual thinking, into the black and white, us and them, right and wrong. By sitting with others, by being fully present, by allowing their stories to impact us, to enter us, and to change us, it brings a complexity to our understanding of each other, of ourselves, of God, of our relationship with creation. I think in that quality of presence as well, it creates a safety for that vulnerability that you were talking about. It allows us to hold space for ourselves and for each other in a way that often we just don't get the chance to do. And I think in some of the comments on your question that came through, this thing of we're so attuned and trained to focus on the doing that we've forgotten, or we haven't really lived out this thing of just us as humans on this earth is valuable in and of itself. And the quality of how we bring ourselves does create safety, or the opposite, if that quality isn't a peaceful quality.
Brilliant, thank you. Would you mind just, you've kind of gone into a bit of it, but would you mind sharing a little bit more of your kind of story and the role that reconciliation has played, particularly kind of being present as part of reconciliation?
Sure. The first thing, actually, my own personal experience with it has really been over the last few years in learning to be present with myself. Actually, I grew up as a third culture kid here in the UK to Middle Eastern parents. I went to Catholic schools my whole life, I grew up and was baptized in the Orthodox Church, and I'm working at an evangelical organization. And so living in a complexity both of an inner world and an outer world, over the last few years, I've really had to learn what it is to be present to who I am, and to not just keep allowing these layers of narrative and identity build up without me really understanding who I am. And so learning presence with myself with the help of others and others accompanying me has been a deeply valuable experience, and has allowed me to live more comfortably in my own skin. And then particularly on the kind of peace building reconciliation side of the work, I guess there's kind of two stories I'd love to share. One which was my first experience really of what being present can do. This was outside of Tearfund actually. This was when I first started this journey in the reconciliation peace building world, if you like. And I was living in the West Bank at the time, and I was attending this training called Compassionate Listening, and it all sounded really weird and hip and kind of new agey. And it was possibly one of the most profound experiences, and I can still enter into that space. And the experience was this group who run this training called Compassionate Listening had brought women from the West Bank and Israeli women from across the wall together to share space and to share stories. And in and of itself, bringing people together is a form of beginning reconciliation. But what was incredible about I think it was 5 days together, was we all had to, and it was my first time as well, we all had to learn to actively listen. I think many of us probably grow up learning to listen to respond, as opposed to listen to just be present. And I saw it both for myself and for the women in the room, that as we would actually training, taking tools and trying them out, and learning to actively listen to one another, the spirit in the room, the quality and depth of relationships shifted day by day. And it was incredible to see that as we learnt to listen actively, and without the need to have the answers for the other, but just to hold space for the other, the threads of common humanity began to come out really quickly. And the ability for those women then to find stories that somehow resembled each other in their day-to-day life. Of course, there were differences, and there's the bigger complexities of the life that they live divided from each other, but within themselves they were able to find a shared humanity just by that process of learning to actively be present and listen to one another. Also in our work at Tearfund, we've seen it through the work that we do around conflict transformation, where our first port of call when we bring people together across different sectarian divides, across tribes, across faiths, is to allow space for storytelling, is to allow space for people to bring themselves into the room. And every time, without fail, there is a profound moment where the penny drops and everybody realizes that we have more in common with each other than we do have difference with one another.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing those stories, and for bringing of yourself into this as well. So a little bit about kind of the context that we're facing now, what's happening right now. We're hearing a lot about the value of slowing down, people having more time on their hands. That's not going to be the case for everybody right now, but what might being present look like right now?
It's been a real challenge for me personally, actually. So I'm currently on my own in my flat, and I'm a person who tends to fill my life with people around me, and it's been a humbling process, actually, of realizing how much physical presence is important, and how hard it is actually to be physically distant from one another, especially from those that we're close to. And even when people are going through stuff, not actually physically being able to be close to, we can do it over virtual meetings, etc. But just to acknowledge that actually the physical distance is hard, because I think we're built as humanity to be close to one another. And I guess just to say, what I've tried to learn in this space is to just be present to what it is. I've heard both ends of the value of slowing down, and you get all of these Instagrammers who are telling us to take up every sort of exercise and habit and new things. And actually, what I'm finding is I just need to take it day by day, and I just need to be present to whatever it is that is needed for the now, because the reality is we can try and build a framework that gets us through this in the best possible way, but none of us have done this before. And so I think if we can commit to being present to ourselves and as much as possible to those around us, it will help us go beyond just surviving, but perhaps even being able to cultivate that quality of presence that we need in this particular time.
Thank you so much. That's great, and I hope for everyone watching that's been really useful for you too. We're going to come on to a time of Q&A with Victoria and I and Mariam in just a moment. Just to say that this stuff isn't easy. Some of the stuff we've talked about, it's not comfortable, it's tough, but we believe it can bring about real change, and we really want to learn to do it together with you. If you haven't already signed up to join the movement, which is the part of Difference where we can send you a monthly resource with reflections, with people's stories, then we'd love you to do that. You can keep regularly in touch with us that way, and you can sign up by using the web address that's on that slide. We've now got time for a bit of Q&A, so I'm going to invite Kira onto the call, who's going to share with us some of the questions that you have been writing. Kira.
Thanks everyone for your questions. Victoria, could you please speak to how do we develop the serenity required to be present? And how do we focus on that when there are so many distractions, which we talked a bit about? And Mariam, after Victoria's answered about finding serenity, could you talk to us about how to cope with the risk of being misunderstood when it comes to the company that we keep? How to cope with the risk of being misunderstood when it comes to the company we keep?
Wow, really good questions by the sound of it. So the one about how do we develop the serenity to be present? I think my instinct is to say you don't need to be serene to be present. I think, as I said earlier on, there's absolutely value in being in the best frame of mind you can be in. So in the middle of a heated argument, taking 5 minutes, taking a bit of time is all good. But actually, being able to bring your unserene self to a difficult conversation is, I think, as much what we've been talking about in being present, being able to say, I actually really, I struggle with that, and maybe it's quite emotive for me, and I find it very difficult to have this conversation. I think that's as much about being present as being serene, because it's not just there to receive a story, it's also there to bring who you are. So that would be my instinct.
Should I jump in on the next question on the how to cope with the risk of being misunderstood when it comes to the company we keep? My initial thought on that was that there is a risk, and there is a risk in, especially if I've understood the question right, if we are crossing boundaries and barriers with those who are different to us and who our own perhaps might not appreciate us being with, that there is a risk that we take, and that is a risk that we have to choose, and that can often end up in relationships not always flourishing or continuing to flourish. But I think the how to cope bit is to really spend time both with ourselves and with those who perhaps are misunderstanding us, to really be clear on our intention and to be clear on what it is inside us of why we're keeping that company. And if you are convicted and convinced, and you have done the work of really questioning yourself, as well as trying to understand from others why that risk might end up in them not appreciating the company you keep, then sometimes that's just something we have to accept, unfortunately. I'd love to give you a fluffier answer, but my experience is that we need to be driven by our conviction and our intentionality, but also have that challenged by others. Sorry, it's a bit of a convoluted answer, but I hope that goes somewhere to answer your question a bit.
Thanks, Mariam. Luke, could you talk to us about what being present might look like in a post-COVID-19 world?
Well, I can give it a go. I think on one level, I'm very much not qualified to say what a post-COVID-19 world is going to look like. And I think on that, there's something about being present that is actually about the present moment. And actually, at the moment, there is a lot of looking forward. There's a lot of trying to anticipate what might come next. You know, we're looking to guidance about what things are going to look like. And I think being present in the moment, being aware of how we're feeling in the here and now is really important. But we've developed these habits to be used in kind of any context. This is really about a way of being rather than something specific for a certain time or place. So at the risk of it sounding like a little bit of a politician's answer, I think being present is something we can take into that space, that we can learn to do. And we don't know what the world is going to look like right now, but that process can be helped by us continuing to be aware of ourselves, how we're feeling, and taking it all back to God as well, and having that deep base of trust with him, I think.
Thanks, Luke. Mariam, could you talk to us about how we could help others be more present? If we're feeling like they're not being present, how could we make them feel more present? And also, how do we balance keeping attention on someone else while also being able to bring our whole selves, so needing to think about ourselves as well?
Thanks, Cara. I would say that one of the things that I've had to learn personally, and definitely I'm not good at, and I'm learning the hard way, is learning how to articulate what I need to others. And so in trying to help others, I need to understand what it is that I need from them. In some ways, I try to take the approach that it's not my place to change anybody else, but it is my place as much as possible to be honest and open and vulnerable to what it is that I need, and to then bring that into a dialogue with others as to where we can then reconcile and find a middle ground between us.
Thanks, Mariam. Victoria, could you give us any explanation and any tips as to why being present and bringing our whole selves to our immediate family, those closest to us, is often the hardest thing to do?
Oh gosh, I'm not a psychologist, so I put that disclaimer first of all. I think the stakes are higher. The closer the relationship, the more likely we are to come into contact with that person frequently. Perhaps we know them well, they know us well, we know that they could use it against us if the relationship really isn't strong. And so I think it's probably a bit of that, and the fact that it will reverberate further. And I wonder if it's a bit like performing in front of a whole load of people you don't know can be sometimes easier than doing it in front of people who are going to give you feedback, and there's going to be, it's going to resonate longer. But I do think it's so hard, but it's also so rewarding in those very, very close relationships. I think it's probably rewarded more than it's taken advantage of, hopefully.
I was just going to say as well, to that point, I think the value of those relationships is often we can build a relationship over time. And I think being present isn't about sitting your family down and getting, here is everything about me that I feel like you need to know. But actually, you know, God is gentle with us in this stuff. And maybe it's just taking steps with people. I think, like, I was sat around with my family at the dinner table the other night, and there was something I really wanted to share with them, but I felt like it was quite a vulnerable thing. And I took a moment and I had a quick prayer, and then I said it, and it was fine, and it opened up a whole conversation. But just little steps like that with people we're familiar with can be, just a really wonderful thing.
Thanks, Luke. Victoria, someone's just inquiring a bit more about being present with nature, and does that include things that like humans do or humanity do, like art and industry and commerce?
That's such a great question, and I think it absolutely can. We can get very romantic about what nature means, and actually the whole of creation is varied, and a garden might seem like the most natural thing in the world, but actually human beings have planted it and cultivated it. So where does nature end and kind of human activity begin can be quite a complex question. And I think it's absolutely about engaging with all of the created world, including where human hands have had a bigger or lesser part in that, and even more so when it comes to sitting in the mess, because quite often that's where the mess is as well.
Thanks, Victoria. I think that's it from the floor. So back to you guys.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Kira. And thank you to everyone watching for sharing your questions. It's been brilliant to have that kind of virtual discussion with you. And big thank you to Mariam for joining us on this webinar. Definitely ups the value of what we're doing, and hopefully for you guys watching, that wisdom will be really helpful for you. Just a few points before we wrap up. Just a reminder, our next webinar will be next week at 8 p.m. We're looking at that final habit, reimagine. And we've got Renee August, who's going to be joining us for that. It's going to be great. I would love you to register for it if you haven't already, and we'd love to see you there. We're going to close by saying the encounter prayer that Victoria spoke about earlier, and I'm going to ask Victoria to lead us through that now.
Thank you. So just as we were talking about those times when it's very difficult to be present, I have myself prayed this before those moments, and maybe it can be useful to you as well. So, loving God, fill us with your spirit now. Help us be curious about other stories, listening as often as we speak. Give us the courage to be present, engaging our whole and unique selves. Inspire us to reimagine what's possible, finding hope by glimpsing you at work. In Jesus' name, Amen.
Fantastic. That brings us to the end of our webinar. God bless you. Have a wonderful week, and we will see you next time.